"I'm never getting out!" Ezra Whitfield's anguished cry echoed through the debtor's prison as Ray Charles walked past the cells during a charitable visit to Atlanta County Correctional Facility. The 32-year-old former church organist was serving time for unpaid medical bills after his daughter's surgery, trapped in a system that imprisoned families for poverty. What Ray discovered that day would spark a legal revolution that would free thousands of Americans from a justice system that criminalized financial hardship. But to understand how one musician's visit to a prison became a nationwide crusade for criminal justice reform, you need to know about the letter that would reach the desk of the governor of Georgia, and the decision Ray Charles was about to make that would prove sometimes the most powerful performances happen not on stage, but in courtrooms and legislative halls across America. It was November 8, 1969, and Ray Charles had agreed to visit Atlanta County Correctional Facility as part of a Thanksgiving charity initiative organized by local churches. The facility housed not just criminals, but also dozens of men imprisoned under Georgia's debtor laws. People whose only crime was being unable to pay medical bills, court fees, or other debts deemed willful non-payment by the courts. Ray had been guided through the facility by Warden Florence Garrett, a pragmatic administrator who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the number of non-violent debtors filling cells that could have housed actual criminals. "Mr. Charles," she had explained as they walked through the corridors, "about 30% of our population is here for debt-related offenses. These aren't dangerous people. They're fathers who can't pay child support, families who can't afford medical bills, people who fell behind on court fees." The prison had been built in 1891 and retained many of the architectural features of 19th century correctional facilities. The cells were small, barely 8 feet by 10 feet, with barred windows that let in thin streams of afternoon light. It was in this setting that Ray first heard Ezra Whitfield's voice, a rich, trained baritone that seemed to fill the entire cell block as he sang Amazing Grace. Ray stopped walking. In 30 years of professional music, he had developed an ear for exceptional talent, and what he was hearing from Cell Block C was extraordinary. The voice had the technical precision of classical training, combined with the emotional depth that comes from genuine suffering. "Who is that singing?" Ray asked Warden Garrett. "That's Ezra Whitfield. He's been here for 8 months. Former church organist from Savannah. His 4-year-old daughter needed emergency heart surgery, and the medical bills bankrupted the family. When he couldn't make the court-ordered payments, the judge sentenced him to 18 months. Ray was quiet for a moment, processing what he had just heard. "He's in prison because he couldn't pay his daughter's medical bills." "Yes, sir. Under Georgia law, if a judge determines that someone is willfully refusing to pay a debt they have the ability to pay, they can be sentenced to up to 2 years in prison. The problem is, most of these men genuinely don't have the money." Ray asked to meet Ezra Whitfield personally. When the cell door opened, he found a thin man with prematurely gray hair sitting on a narrow cot, his hands folded in his lap. Ezra looked up with the kind of exhausted resignation that comes from months of imprisonment for something he couldn't control. "Mr. Whitfield," Ray said, stepping into the cell. "I'm Ray Charles. I heard you singing just now. You have an incredible voice." Ezra's eyes widened slightly. "Ray Charles? The Ray Charles? I used to play your songs on the church organ. The congregation loved I Can't Stop Loving You as a hymn arrangement. Tell me about your situation," Ray said, settling onto the single chair in the cell. Ezra's story was heartbreakingly simple. He had worked as the organist at First Baptist Church of Savannah for 12 years, earning a modest but stable income that supported his wife Martha and their daughter Rebecca. When Rebecca was born with a congenital heart defect, the family had managed the medical expenses through a combination of insurance, church fundraising, and personal savings. But when Rebecca needed emergency surgery at age 4, the costs overwhelmed their resources. The surgery itself cost $18,000, more than Ezra earned in 2 years. Even after insurance coverage, the family owed $6,200 to the hospital and various specialists. "I tried to work out a payment plan," Ezra explained to Ray. "I was paying $50 a month, which was all I could manage. but the hospital took me to court, saying I could pay more if I wanted to. The judge ordered me to pay $200 a month, or face imprisonment. $200 a month, Ray asked, on an organist's salary. That was more than half my income after taxes. I tried to explain to the judge that we needed money for rent, food, utilities, but he said if saving my daughter's life was really important to me, I'd find a way to pay. When I missed the third payment, he sentenced me to 18 months in prison. Ray was stunned. He had grown up in poverty and understood financial hardship, but the idea that someone could be imprisoned for being unable to pay medical bills seemed fundamentally unjust. What happens to your family while you're here? Ray asked. Martha works as a seamstress now, but she barely makes enough to keep the apartment. Rebecca stays with Martha's sister most of the time. Ezra's voice broke slightly. My daughter needed her father, especially after the surgery, and instead I'm sitting in a prison cell because I couldn't pay the bills for saving her life. Ray spent the next 2 hours talking with Ezra and other debtors in the facility. Each story was similar. Ordinary people whose lives had been derailed by medical emergencies, job loss, or other financial crises beyond their control. Many were the sole breadwinners for their families, meaning their imprisonment created even greater financial hardship for the people they were trying to support. The system makes no sense, Chaplain Benjamin Cross told Ray as they walked back through the facility. We imprison men for debt, which prevents them from earning money to pay the debt. Their families go on welfare, costing the state more money. Meanwhile, we're housing and feeding these men at taxpayer expense. Everyone loses. Ray left the prison that day with a profound sense of outrage and a determination to do something about what he had witnessed. But unlike his previous charitable work, which had focused on individual cases, Ray realized that the debt prison system required a different approach, legal and political reform, rather than personal assistance. That evening, Ray called his lawyer, David Berman, one of Atlanta's most respected civil rights attorneys. David, I need you to look into something for me. I visited the county prison today and I found out that Georgia is imprisoning people for being too poor to pay their bills. That can't be legal, can it? Berman was familiar with debtor imprisonment laws, which had been on the books in various forms since colonial times. Ray, it's more complicated than it appears on the surface. The courts don't technically imprison people for being poor. They imprison them for contempt of court when they fail to comply with payment orders. But you're right that the practical effect is imprisoning people for poverty. I want to challenge this, Ray said. These laws are wrong, and I want to help change them. Berman explained that challenging the debtor imprisonment system would require a comprehensive legal strategy, significant financial resources, and considerable time. We're talking about taking on the entire state legal system, Ray. Are you sure you want to get involved in something this complex? I'm sure, Ray replied without hesitation. What followed was one of the most intensive legal and advocacy campaigns of Ray Charles's career. Working with Berman and a team of civil rights lawyers, Ray developed a multi-pronged strategy to challenge Georgia's debtor imprisonment laws through the courts, while simultaneously building public pressure for legislative reform. The legal team identified Ezra Whitfield as the perfect test case. His situation exemplified everything wrong with the current system. He was clearly not a criminal, his debt arose from a medical emergency, and his imprisonment was actually making it impossible for him to pay what he owed. Berman filed a habeas corpus petition on Ezra's behalf, arguing that his imprisonment violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Meanwhile, Ray used his celebrity platform to bring media attention to the issue. He gave interviews to newspapers and television stations, always focusing on specific cases like Ezra's, to illustrate the human impact of the laws. We're not talking about people who are trying to cheat the system, Ray would explain. We're talking about fathers who are in prison because they couldn't pay their children's medical bills. The story resonated with the public in ways that surprised even Ray's legal team. Letters poured into Governor Lester Maddox's office demanding reform. Newspaper editorials criticized the debtor imprisonment system. Church groups organized petition drives calling for legislative action. Ray also funded his own investigation into the scope of the problem. The research revealed that more than 3,000 people were imprisoned for debt-related offenses across Georgia's county jails, with similar numbers in other southern states. The cost to taxpayers was enormous. It cost approximately $15 per day to house each prisoner, meaning the state was spending over $16 million annually to imprison people for being poor. The breakthrough came when Ray convinced 60 Minutes to do a feature story on debtor imprisonment. The segment, which aired in March 1970, featured interviews with Ray, Ezra Whitfield, and several other imprisoned debtors. The national exposure created pressure on Georgia politicians to address the issue before it became a source of ongoing embarrassment for the state. Governor Maddox, initially resistant to reform, began to reconsider his position as public opinion shifted. The turning point came when Ray arranged for a private meeting between the governor and Ezra Whitfield, who had been released on bond pending his legal appeal. Governor Ezra said during the meeting, "I understand the importance of people paying their debts, but I can't pay anything while I'm sitting in a prison cell. Give me a chance to work, and I'll pay every penny I owe. Keep me in prison, and my debt will never be paid, and my family will need public assistance." The logic was undeniable, and Governor Maddox agreed to work with the legislature on reform legislation. The Georgia Debtor Relief Act of 1970 fundamentally changed how the state handled debt-related cases. The new law required courts to consider a debtor's actual ability to pay before issuing imprisonment orders, mandated that alternative arrangements be explored before incarceration, and provided for the immediate review of all current debt-related imprisonments. Ezra Whitfield was among the first 200 people released under the new law. But more importantly, the Georgia legislation became a model for similar reforms in other states. Ray continued his advocacy work nationally, working with legal organizations and civil rights groups to challenge debtor imprisonment laws across the country. By 1975, 12 states had reformed or eliminated their debtor imprisonment statutes, directly affecting thousands of families who were no longer at risk of losing breadwinners to a system that criminalized poverty. The legal precedents established in the Georgia cases were cited in successful challenges to similar laws nationwide. Ray's involvement in criminal justice reform had a profound impact on his understanding of his role as a public figure. "I learned that being famous gives you a platform, and having a platform creates responsibility," he reflected in a 1972 interview. "I can't solve every social problem, but when I see something that's clearly wrong, and I have the ability to help fix it, I have an obligation to act." Ezra Whitfield's life stabilized after his release. He found work as a music director at a Baptist church in Atlanta, and his family was able to establish a realistic payment plan for their medical debt. More importantly, his case had helped change a system that had been trapping families in cycles of poverty and imprisonment for generations. "Ray Charles saved my life," Ezra said during a 1973 interview. "But he did more than that. He saved thousands of families from going through what my family went through." That's the kind of legacy that goes far beyond music. The debt prison reform campaign established Ray Charles as one of the entertainment industry's most effective social justice advocates. His approach, combining legal expertise, media savvy, and sustained commitment to systemic change. Ray continued his involvement in criminal justice issues throughout the 1970s and 1980s, supporting bail reform, prison education programs, and alternative sentencing initiatives. But he always identified the debtor imprisonment campaign as his most important non-musical achievement. "Music brought me fame and fortune," Ray said in his final interview on the subject in 1999. "But using that fame to help change unjust laws, that brought me something more valuable than money or recognition. It brought me the knowledge that my life had served a purpose beyond entertainment." Today, debtor imprisonment has been largely eliminated in the United States, though advocates continue to monitor and challenge practices that effectively criminalize poverty. The legal precedents established in the Georgia cases continue to be cited in contemporary civil rights litigation, and law schools use Ray Charles's advocacy campaign as a case study in effective legal and social reform strategies. Ezra Whitfield lived until 2008, spending his later years as a music educator and advocate for criminal justice reform. In his final interview, he reflected on the experience that had changed his life and thousands of others. Ray Charles taught me that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on stages or in studios, but in courtrooms and legislative halls, Ezra said. He showed me that when you have the ability to fight injustice, you have the responsibility to use it. That's a lesson that goes far beyond music. It's about what it means to be a human being who cares about other human beings. The story of Ray Charles and the Debt Prison Reform Campaign serves as a reminder that systemic injustices require systematic solutions, and that individuals with platforms and resources have the power to create change that extends far beyond their immediate sphere of influence. It demonstrates that the most lasting legacy any person can leave is not what they accomplished for themselves, but what they did to make the world more just and compassionate for others. The impact of Ray's Debt Prison Reform Campaign extended far beyond the immediate legal victories and legislative changes. The campaign established new precedents for celebrity activism and demonstrated how entertainment figures could effectively use their platforms to drive substantive social change, rather than simply raising awareness or funds for existing causes. Legal scholars studying the Georgia cases identified several key factors that made Ray's advocacy campaign uniquely effective. First, Ray had invested significant time in understanding the technical legal aspects of the issue, working closely with attorneys to develop strategies that addressed both the constitutional and practical problems with debt imprisonment laws. Second, he had focused on specific compelling cases like Ezra Whitfield's that illustrated the human impact of unjust policies in ways that resonated with ordinary citizens. Most importantly, Ray had committed to sustained, long-term engagement rather than treating the issue as a one-time charitable gesture. Many celebrities get involved in causes for a few months and then move on to something else, observed Professor Margaret Chen of Emory Law School, who wrote extensively about the debt prison cases. Ray Charles stayed involved for years, through legislative sessions, court appeals, and implementation challenges. That kind of sustained commitment is what it takes to create real systemic change. The legal precedents established in the Georgia debt prison cases continued to influence civil rights law for decades. The key ruling is that imprisoning people for inability to pay debts violated the Equal Protection Clause, was cited in hundreds of subsequent cases involving various forms of wealth-based discrimination in the justice system. In 1971, the Supreme Court referenced the Georgia precedent in Tate v. Short, ruling that states could not automatically convert unpaid fines into jail time without considering the defendant's ability to pay. The decision directly affected thousands of people who were serving time for traffic violations, minor infractions, and other low-level offenses, simply because they couldn't afford to pay court-ordered fines. Ray's involvement in the Tate case came about when attorneys working on the Supreme Court brief reached out to him for support. Ray provided funding for the legal challenge and helped organize media attention around the case, using the same strategies he had developed during the Georgia campaign. Ray understood something that many advocates miss, explained David Berman, Ray's attorney throughout the debt prison reform campaign. Legal victories are just the beginning. You have to follow through with implementation, monitoring, and ongoing pressure to make sure the changes actually happen in practice. This understanding led Ray to establish the Charles Institute for Criminal Justice Reform in 1972, an organization focused specifically on monitoring and challenging wealth-based discrimination in the legal system. Unlike traditional civil rights organizations that worked on a broad range of issues, the Charles Institute maintained a narrow focus on cases where poverty was effectively criminalized. The Institute's first major project was a comprehensive study of bail practices across the South. The research revealed that thousands of people were remaining in jail before trial simply because they couldn't afford bail, even for minor offenses. Many were losing their jobs, apartments, and family stability during these pre-trial incarcerations, often for charges that were eventually dismissed or resulted in probation rather than jail time. Working with local attorneys and advocacy groups, the Charles Institute challenged excessive bail practices in 12 states, arguing that the current system violated the same constitutional principles that had been established in the debt prison cases. The campaign resulted in bail reform legislation in 8 states, and new judicial guidelines requiring courts to consider defendants' ability to pay when setting bail amounts. Ray's personal involvement in these cases often made the difference between success and failure. When the Louisiana legislature was considering bail reform legislation, Ray testified before the State Judiciary Committee, bringing with him 3 families whose breadwinners were sitting in jail awaiting trial for minor offenses they couldn't afford to bail out of. Honorable members of this committee, Ray said during his testimony, "I'm here today because I've seen what happens when poverty becomes a crime. I've met fathers who lost their jobs because they couldn't afford $500 bail for a traffic violation. I've met mothers who had their children taken away because they were in jail awaiting trial for writing a bad check. These are not dangerous criminals, these are working people whose only real crime is being poor." The Louisiana Bail Reform Act passed by a wide margin and became a model for similar legislation in other states. Ray's advocacy work also influenced his musical career in unexpected ways. Beginning in 1973, he incorporated themes of social justice and legal reform into his concerts, often dedicating songs to people who had been affected by unjust laws. His performances of Georgia on My Mind frequently included spoken introductions about his reform work in Georgia, connecting his musical legacy to his advocacy efforts. These concert dedications served a practical purpose as well as an artistic one. Ray discovered that many audience members had personal experiences with wealth-based discrimination in the justice system, and his concerts became informal opportunities for people to share their stories and connect with legal resources. "I started keeping a notebook of the stories people would tell me after shows," Ray recalled in a 1980 interview. Mothers whose sons were in jail because they couldn't afford bail. Working people who had warrants out for unpaid fines. Families who had been bankrupted by legal fees for minor offenses. "I realized that what we had uncovered in Georgia was just the tip of the iceberg." This grassroots intelligence gathering led to some of the Charles Institute's most successful cases. In 1975, Ray learned from a concert goer in Birmingham that Alabama was routinely imprisoning people for unpaid court costs and administrative fees associated with traffic violations. The subsequent investigation revealed that the state was operating what amounted to a modern debtor's prison system, with over 2,000 people incarcerated for fee-related offenses. The Alabama case was particularly significant because it demonstrated how debt imprisonment had evolved since the Georgia reforms. Instead of directly imprisoning people for unpaid medical bills or consumer debts, states were accomplishing the same thing by layering administrative fees, court costs, and penalty assessments onto minor violations, then imprisoning people who couldn't pay these government-imposed debts. "It was the same unjust system with different terminology," explained Sarah Rodriguez, who served as the Charles Institute's legal director from 1975 to 1985. "Instead of medical debt, it was court costs. Instead of willful non-payment, it was contempt of court. But the end result was identical: people were going to prison because they were too poor to pay bills imposed on them by the government." The Alabama litigation took 3 years and ultimately reached the state Supreme Court, which ruled that imprisoning people for inability to pay court costs violated both the state constitution and federal civil rights law. The decision freed more than 1,500 people who were serving time for fee-related offenses and established new procedural requirements for courts to follow before incarcerating anyone for financial obligations. Ray's involvement in criminal justice reform also led to unexpected partnerships with other entertainment figures who were inspired by his systematic approach to advocacy. In 1976, he worked with Johnny Cash to establish a program providing legal services to prisoners who were incarcerated for poverty-related offenses. The partnership combined Ray's legal expertise with Cash's connections in the prison reform community, creating a model for collaborative celebrity activism. "Ray taught me that good intentions aren't enough," Cash said during a joint interview about their collaboration. "You have to understand the legal system, you have to work with qualified attorneys, and you have to commit to staying involved for the long term. Ray showed me how to turn concern into effective action." The Cash Charles Legal Defense Fund, as it came to be known, provided direct representation to hundreds of prisoners while also supporting larger legal challenges to unjust practices. The fund's most notable success was a class action lawsuit in Texas that resulted in the release of over 800 people who were incarcerated for various forms of financial non-compliance. By 1980, the various legal and advocacy efforts that Ray had initiated or supported had directly affected the cases of more than 10,000 people who had been imprisoned for poverty-related offenses. The legal precedents established in these cases continued to influence court decisions and legislative debates across the country. But Ray's most important contribution may have been demonstrating how sustained, informed advocacy could create systemic change rather than just helping individual cases. The model he developed, combining legal expertise, media attention, grassroots organization, and long-term commitment, became a template for other social justice campaigns. Ray Charles proved that celebrity activism could be more than symbolic, observed Dr. Robert Jenkins of the Civil Rights Institute, who studied the debt prison reform campaign extensively. He showed that entertainment figures could drive real policy change if they were willing to do the hard work of understanding complex issues and committing to long-term engagement. The Charles Institute continued its work until Ray's death in 2004, and then transitioned into the Ray Charles Foundation for Legal Justice, which continues to monitor and challenge wealth-based discrimination in the criminal justice system. The Foundation's current work focuses on modern manifestations of the same problems Ray identified in the 1970s, including excessive fines and fees, cash bail systems, and debt-based license suspensions. Ezra Whitfield remained involved with the Foundation's work throughout his life, serving on its board of directors and frequently sharing his story at legal conferences and law school seminars. His case continued to be cited in legal textbooks and court decisions as an example of how individual stories can drive systemic reform. "Ray Charles changed my life when he got me out of that prison cell," Ezra reflected during his final interview in 2007, "but he changed thousands of other lives by making sure that what happened to me couldn't happen to anyone else." That's the difference between charity and justice. Charity helps one person at a time, but justice changes the system so that help isn't needed. The debt prison reform campaign also had a lasting impact on Ray's own understanding of his role as an artist and public figure. In his later interviews, he frequently spoke about the responsibility that came with fame and the importance of using platforms for purposes beyond entertainment. "Music made me famous, but advocacy made me useful," Ray said in a 1995 speech at the NAACP's annual convention. "Fame gives you a microphone, but what you say into that microphone determines whether you've made a difference in the world." Today, more than 50 years after Ray Charles first heard Ezra Whitfield singing in that Atlanta prison cell, the legal principles established in their case continue to protect Americans from being imprisoned for poverty. The Georgia Debtor Relief Act of 1970 remains in effect, and its provisions have been strengthened over the decades through additional legislation and court decisions. Law schools across the country use the debt prison cases as examples of effective public interest litigation, and the Charles Institute's advocacy model continues to influence how legal organizations approach systemic reform campaigns. The story serves as a reminder that lasting social change requires not just good intentions, but sustained commitment, strategic thinking, and the courage to challenge unjust systems even when they are deeply entrenched. For Ray Charles, the debt prison reform campaign represented the intersection of his artistic gifts and his moral convictions. It demonstrated that the same creativity and persistence that made him a musical innovator could also make him an effective advocate for social justice. Most importantly, it proved that individual actions, when guided by principle and sustained by commitment, can create change that extends far beyond what any one person might have thought possible. The legacy continues through the ongoing work of legal advocates, policy researchers, and activists who build on the foundations that Ray Charles helped establish. Every person who avoids imprisonment because they cannot afford to pay a debt, every family that stays together because poverty is not treated as a crime, and every community that benefits from more just legal practices owes a debt of gratitude to a musician who refused to accept that being poor should mean being imprisoned. As Ray Charles often said in his later years, the most important audience you'll ever perform for is the audience of people whose lives you can change. They may never buy your records or attend your concerts, but if you use your platform to make their lives better, you've given the performance that matters most.